Welcome to Psych Sessions Late Career. I'm your host, Dave Kreiner. What does late career mean anyway? It can include people who are well into their careers, people who are thinking about retirement, people who are retired but still working, or maybe retired and doing other things. We have conversations with people in all these life situations. If you consider yourself late career, however you happen to define it, or you plan on being a late career person in the future, this podcast is for you. All right, welcome to Psych Sessions Late Careers. I'm your host, Dave Kreiner. I'm here today with Sue Frantz and Barney Beins. And both of you have a number of things in common. But one of the things you have in common is that both of you like to make fun of Barney. So I don't know if that will be a topic of discussion, but another thing both of you have in common is that you're both retired, but in, I think, very different ways. And I thought it might be interesting to start just by having each of you talk a little bit about what you're doing now and how you think about that concept of retirement. Barney, would you like to start with that, with just a little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. My retirement isn't complete yet because it's hard after, I guess I taught my first college level course as a graduate student 52 years ago. And it's hard after doing something for 52 years to just drop it and walk away. So one of the things I'm finishing up now is work with Society for the History of Psychology, and I'm the 2024 president. And so that is winding down now. I'll be past president next year, and that'll conclude my formal affiliation with SHP. And I'm still thinking about doing some writing, like revising the research methods book, and maybe something on the history of psychology. But those are all things that I can occupy small amounts of time, and I don't have to feel that I'm just tethered to my computer anymore. And beyond that, I'm doing a lot of reading and catching up on things that I didn't have time for during my career.
Yeah, that's great, Barney. That sounds like you have a lot more control over what you choose to spend your time on. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, because every day is Saturday.
Nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it worked for me to ease my way into retirement by the college's transition to retirement program. And that made a big difference toward my being comfortable moving from one phase to the next.
And how did that work, Barney, with that phased retirement program?
Well, the college said you could move down to 58% of your normal teaching load and still keep benefits, which was good. And they would give a bonus. You get 58% of your salary plus a bonus for being in the program. Most people taught a reduced load each semester, but I decided it would be worth my while to teach only one semester and then take the other semester off. Because I knew that if I was teaching a reduced load both semesters, I would be doing a full-time job both semesters. And that's not the point of the transition program. So I did one semester on, one semester off. And it made it a whole lot easier when I went officially into retirement to know what I was getting myself into, and then I was prepared for it. So it worked very well for me. Unfortunately, the college doesn't permit the one-on, one-off anymore. So people coming in now have to be there all the time.
58% seems like a really specific percentage, but I'm sure there's somebody in HR who calculated why that has to be the correct number.
Yeah, it's, 7/12 of the 12th of the load, or, something like that. But yeah, it's the HR bean counters who made that decision.
So that doesn't mean, the 58% doesn't mean that you teach one semester and then come back and teach the first 4 days of the next semester. Correct.
If I'd have thought of that, that's exactly what it would have meant.
Well, that's great. How about you, Sue? Can you tell us a little bit about your decision to retire and what retirement looks like in terms of what you're currently working on?
Well, the decision to retire really had more to do with being ready to leave the Seattle area. We had been up there 20 years, and the pandemic happened, and long story short, we could do a whole episode just on our decision to do this. But we decided, let's come back to southern New Mexico. And I worked out a deal with my vice president to work remotely for a year and then do a 1/3 contract. And for us, we were on quarter system. So 1/3 meant one course per quarter. And I told my vice president, I'll retire after that. And she said, deal, go. I was making top of the salary range, so it was an easy decision for her. She saw dollar signs. So we moved, and our retirement guy said, you need to make X amount of dollars in part-time income each year for 10 years for this to work out. And at that time, the easiest way to do that would have been to teach part-time. But in the meantime, I ended up with what's going to be 4 textbooks. Barney knows how this happens. You do one, and then I was brought in as junior author. Chuck Stanger had retired, and he had told the publisher, I'm not interested in doing this anymore. I really want to be retired. And so the publisher finds me, I do the intro psych textbook, and then the publisher says, hey, you know anybody who's interested in doing a social psych book? And I said, well, I'm a social psychologist. He said, yeah, but I didn't want to pile on. So that's how I ended up doing the social psych book, which just published this last year. And
so
then,
that was like the gateway textbook for you. And then it became a habit.
Yeah, it was a foot in the door thing. The first, I foot in the door myself. The first one actually was with Doug Bernstein and Steve Chu, the teaching psychology book that we have with Rutledge. And Doug had written that book with Sandy Goss-Lucas, and Sandy, like Chuck, said, I'm done. Sandy said, I'm busy being a grandmother. So no, I'm not interested in revising this book. So that's when Doug came to me and Steve and said, hey, you want to come in on this? So that actually ended up being my gateway book, because the publisher then for Flat World, that's got the intro in the social book, he went to Doug and said, hey, we've known each other a bunch of years. You know anybody who would be a good intro psych author? And he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. So that's how I ended up getting that gig. And then I got the social book. And then the publisher said, we've got a lot of faculty who are requesting a critical thinking book. Would you be interested? And I said, well, yes, but I don't want to do a traditional critical thinking book, which is all coming out of philosophy. I don't want to spend an entire book talking about logical fallacies and inductive and deductive reasoning. So I roped Linda Wolf into this. So the two of us are going to do a critical thinking and decision-making book. And there's going to be some logical fallacies in there, but for the most part, it's going to be things like cognitive biases, things that are interfering with critical thinking. And then half the book is on decision-making, because ultimately that's the goal, right? It's not... Critical thinking is step one, but in the end, what we really want is for people to make good decisions. And as we know, there are a whole bunch of other factors that go into that. So we're going to start writing that in spring. So that gives me 4 textbooks. So I am tied to my computer. But the original plan wasn't to do these books. The original plan was I would teach part-time. And then Tom Pusateri said, I'm in my second term as executive director for the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. And he said, I can step away anytime as long as I know that somebody good is coming in. So long story short, beginning in January, I'll be the new executive director for STP. So I'm not really, for a while I was saying I was semi-retired. And at some point I realized that's complete and total BS. I'm just differently employed.
Yeah. So I feel like with both of you, what you've described is maybe not the traditional definition of retirement in terms of no longer working. But I feel like this applies to a lot of people that I know, that when they retire, they're really differently employed. As you said, Sue, it's not necessarily I'm retired from my field or I'm retired from doing work, but I'm just choosing to do different things with my time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've talked with several faculty and chairs of psychology departments who wish some of their faculty would retire. And one big issue that seems to get in the way is professional identity. That if you've identified as a professor of psychology for 50 years, in Barney's case, then what does it mean that you are no longer teaching full-time? What do you still maintain that identity? And I feel like I still have that identity. I had it really strongly for quite some time after I had stepped away from full-time teaching. And I feel like that's morphed a little bit. And my identity now is more of author than it is of psychology professor. But obviously, I'm writing about psychology, and writing textbooks feels just like teaching to me, just in a different format. So I don't feel like my identity has really changed in that regard.
It's kind of interesting to hear you talk about the identity thing, and of course, I've had I know faculty members, colleagues who, when they were in transition to retirement, they didn't want to give up the opportunity to sit in on committee meetings. They didn't want to miss the opportunity to engage in hiring processes and tenure processes. And they were just so tied up into that concept of themselves that it seemed senseless to me. And the way I've looked at my career, and my identity, is I had the opportunity to do the things I want. I luckily I liked the teaching. I liked the scholarly work that I did, but my identity was tied into doing things I wanted to do. And so when I retired, in May for the final semester when I was teaching, I wondered in the fall, am I going to go through withdrawal? Because I will be saying I need to get back in the classroom. And there was not a trace of that. And part of it is because, my life's goal is to do what I want. And that chapter of my life was over. And it's not that I didn't want to do it. It's just that other things I was doing that I did want to do. And so I moved on. And so I haven't had any problem with the transition from being an academic to being a retired person. Yeah. And I still do things I want to do.
That sounds great, Barney. So this next question, both of you have referred to this a little bit in terms of making that decision to retire. And you might think of this question along the lines of, let's help Dave figure out what his plan is, which is really the underlying purpose of this whole podcast series that's helped Dave figure out what he should do. Could each of you maybe say a little more about how did you actually make that decision that it was time for you to retire?
Go ahead, Sue.
It's an interesting question, Dave, because it's not an easy one. It wasn't so much okay, I am ready to retire, let's do it. It was more like we were ready to leave Seattle. We were ready to come back to southern New Mexico. And the only way for me to do that was to retire from full-time teaching. So it was more like having our TIA retirement guy say, yes, you can do this, and having all the stars line up that made it possible to do it. So it wasn't so much waking up one morning and saying, yeah, now's time. But it was more like all the blocks lined up, and it was the right thing to do. But like I said, I'm retired from full-time teaching. So I no longer have the committee responsibilities. I'm no longer teaching when I don't want to teach. I can teach part-time anytime I want. Although what I've learned is that it's really hard for me to teach and write at the same time. That it feels like two different things. If I were revising chapters at the same time I was covering them in my class, maybe it would be doable, but it feels like too much of a shift for me, and that I wasn't paying enough attention to my students when I was paying attention to my writing. And now I'm always going to have a book to revise. So that's my long way of saying, Dave, I have no idea when it's going to be right for you. But I would say have something lined up, have part-time teaching lined up, have writing projects lined up, have professional service lined up. As you know, there's plenty of stuff to do in STP.
Right. How about you, Barney?
A podcast.
That's an idea. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Barney, how about you? How did you go about making that decision?
Yeah, it's interesting. It overlaps a lot with what Sue just said. And, I've talked to people who have said, I was driving to work one morning and I said, it's time to quit. But that wasn't even close to what I was doing, because for the last day of teaching, I loved the teaching part. My job was just so much fun because I got to do the things I wanted to do. And I'm not sure what the reason is that led me to say I'm going to retire. It's just, it's time. I worked taught full time till I was 73. And actually, one of the things that I was worried about was that I would lose contact with the students, and that I would be this dry old fogey, and they would be unable to relate to me whatsoever. And that actually never happened. I've seen it happen with other people, but, I always had great relationships with my classes. So in terms of retiring, what was the motivator? I just don't know. But I was thinking, Linda, my wife, and I might want to do stuff, time to spend time with her. And so let me go after it. And, that's basically how my thinking proceeded in terms of retirement. But in preparation, I kept thinking of something that Bill Bustis said, which concerning retirement is one of the smartest things I've ever heard. And he said, when you retire, you're not going to start doing things you haven't done before. So, I want to retire so I can be a cabinet maker. Well, if you haven't been a cabinet maker, when you retire, you're not going to become one. And so what you need to do is figure out what behaviors you want to engage in before you retire so that you can continue to engage in them after you retire. And so I kept that in mind as being something important to do, and which is one of the reasons I was willing to work with the Society for the History of Psychology, because I've been interested in that and figured it was a good thing to continue doing. My wife and I have always been interested in supporting a local theater, so one of my goals was to get more active, and so I'm going to be on the board of one of the local theaters. I'm going to be doing tax preparation help for the elderly, which is sort of a continuation of the quantitative stuff I've done. So if you're going to retire at some point, start your retirement now by figuring out what behaviors you want to engage in and start doing it.
Yeah, I really like that advice also from Bill Buskist. It seems to me to be quite parallel, maybe even the same advice that we would give to somebody who's a student or early in their career when they're thinking about what they'd like to do in their career. For example, if you think you want to be a teacher, you should probably do some teaching before you start that to see if it's a good fit. And what I hear from you, Barney, and from that advice from Bill is if you think that there's something you'd like to do in retirement, you need to be trying it out before retirement to see if that's actually a good fit for you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He offered some great advice.
So speaking of teaching, another purpose that I was hoping to hit with this podcast series is that maybe it would be helpful not just to people like me who are later career, but also maybe to some people earlier in their career who are thinking about the course of their career and how to make those decisions. And I don't know about the two of you, but for me personally, I don't feel like as I made decisions about my career and, teaching particular courses or taking different positions as I've gone through the decades, I don't feel like for me that there was a lot of planning or intentionality with that. A lot of it was, this happened to come up at the right time. So I wonder, sort of looking back at your careers, and both of you spent long stretches of time at a particular institution, a particular university. Could you talk a little bit about how your roles changed over time as your career progressed?
Ooh, I know the answer to this one. So my first full-time teaching job was at New Mexico State University, Alamogordo, a 2-year branch down here in southern New Mexico. And for quite a while, I was the psychology department. So I was heavily reliant on what at the time was the TIPS listserv, Teaching in the Psychological Sciences. It formed sometime in the mid-90s. And I had joined that just before I got this full-time job. And I leaned so heavily on that listserv. And as you may or may not remember, that was just pre-internet. So if I didn't know the answer to a student question or I didn't understand something in chapter 7, I was on that listserv. So I wanted to give back. So when we left southern New Mexico for Seattle for Highline College, I had decided I wanted to get more involved in the psychology community, teaching psychology community at the national level, that I had gotten so much from this community, I wanted to give back. When we got up to Seattle, I got to work on that. And I started off as a reviewer, I think, for Project Syllabus. I think that's where that started. I then became the editor for Project Syllabus, the director for Project Syllabus. And then there were it was during Mary Kite's presidency. She had a task force on, is it time to start offering an online version of our conference? So I was on that task force gathering some data. And then I kept hearing people talk about the AP Psych reading, so I finally put my name in for that. And I've had occasion to tell many people that was the best thing I ever did for my career, and that is hands down true. Part of it was learning how to write better questions so that they could be actually scored by a rubric. I got so much better at creating rubrics for scoring. And then just all the people that I met and got to know through there. I got to know both of you through the AP Psych reading. And so the people that I knew have given me tremendous opportunities for the rest of my career. And then, of course, I end up thanks to Barney, become a recipient of the Brewer Award. Barney was the one who nominated me. And I'm going to go ahead and tell this story. So it was at an AP reading. And Dave, as you know, when we're done reading, it's a free-for-all. It ends up being a party. So that night, if I remember correctly, we were heading to a Louisville Bats baseball game. And Barney and I are walking down to the stadium, and we stop off for a beer, because that's what you do at the reading, is you stop off for beers. So Barney and I are having a couple beers at this bar, and Barney says, I want to nominate you for the Brewer Award. And I was so touched by that. So we have a moment, and then months go by. We go home, we go back to work, and then sometime deep in the fall, Barney says, okay, we need to put the packet together for your Brewer Award nomination. And I said, oh, you were serious? I thought you were just drunk. To which Barney says,
well, I may have been.
And that's what Barney said. He said, I may well have been. But
he was serious too.
Yes, too.
Seriously drunk. Yeah.
Seriously drunk and serious about the award. Barney's a very serious guy. So, so for me, it was so much of my career, how I ended up in college in the first place. It was totally accidental. There was nothing intentional about it. But deciding I wanted, in that transition to a college where we had half a dozen psychology faculty, to have this opportunity to give back to the profession felt very important to me. And that really was intentional. Now, I don't remember what your original question was, Dave, but that's my answer.
I don't think I remember either, but I like those stories. And so what I distilled from that, Sue, was people should think about getting involved in what they care about. And for you, it was contributing to the teaching of psychology world, whether that was STP, getting involved in the AP reading. And I think the biggest lesson I extracted from what you just said is that if you want to be the recipient of APA's highest teaching award, you definitely should have a beer with Barney Beins.
That is correct. Yeah, that's the biggest lesson there. A few weeks ago, Verla and I were out at a favorite local restaurant here in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and who comes walking around the corner but a colleague from Highline, which is in Seattle, which is nowhere close to New Mexico. And it turns out that she was down here because she was giving a workshop with some other people. And she said, some time ago, I had advised her colleague in her department at Highline, how do you keep from being basically so subsumed by this institution? And apparently what I said was, get involved in something outside of the institution. Get involved in one of your professional associations, for example. And that sounded like something that I would say. And so when that information was communicated to this person I ran into at this restaurant, she said, I really took that to heart, and that's what I've been doing. And it has really kept me from being burnout and so consumed by everything at the institution that I've got meaningful work outside that I can drop my brain on. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of get involved in your professional associations. I did stuff with APA. I've done plenty of stuff with STP. We've got plenty of things for people who want to get involved in STP to do. Please come join us.
I've definitely found that to be true as well. Barney, would you share a little bit about how you sort of navigated those changes in roles and responsibilities as your career progressed?
Yeah. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap in this regard with what you said in terms of getting involved in that sort of thing. But not surprisingly, Sue, you are a whole lot more thoughtful about things than I am. And, my life has been a series of one sort of unplanned accident after another. And after I finished graduate school with no jobs available, I worked for a year at Blue Cross of Central Ohio as a statistical analyst. And it was the worst year of my life. And I knew I didn't want to do it. But then there was a friend told me about a job, and it was at Thomas More College. I applied there. He did too. One of us got the job, and it wasn't him. But it was there were 150 applicants, and I was number 2. But the pay was so bad, number 1 said, no thanks. So I wound up at Thomas More, and then my friend and colleague Bill Porter there at one point said, do you know about the Journal Teaching of Psychology? And I hadn't known anything, and so I took a look and got involved with STP as a result. And it wasn't any great plan. It was just, this would be kind of fun to do. And then I met Charles Brewer and became a reviewer for TOP. And I remember one year, I counted up at the end of the year, I had reviewed 84 manuscripts for him.
Wow.
Yeah. But it was fun.
How much did Charles pay you for that?
The standard amount.
Okay. Yeah. Understood.
And then when I was at Thomas More, I met a core of the STP group, like Randy Smith, Dave Johnson, Bill Hill, Linda Noble, and thought, I like these people. And so, I got involved with STP and with that group, and then I wound up applying for a job at Ithaca and got that. And again, the kind of things that nobody plans for, at least I didn't plan for them. A book rep once came up to me and said, are you interested in writing a book? This was when book reps came in person to your office and would talk to you. Are you interested in writing a book? And I said, how about research methods? And she said, okay, well, I'll go back to my office and I'll write up a contract and send it to you. So she mailed me a contract. I signed it and sent it back to her. And then, so the research methods book came out. And then, sometime later, Chris Cardone said, you interested in writing a book? And I said, how about writing? I'm writing. And can my daughter be a co-author? And she said, fine. And none of this is forethought on my part. It's just, more my, self-centered pursuit of happiness. What can I do now that's going to make me happy? And, that's what it was. So I just went and pursued one thing after another that fulfilled me, and that's what it came down to. And that's how, thinking back on one of your other questions, I didn't have to worry about what is my identity, as an academic and what's going to happen when I'm no longer an academic, because that wasn't the point of my life. It was just an important component that allowed me to do what I wanted to. And I remember once Jeff Holmes, who both of you know, he asked me when I was nearing retirement, how did I manage to be as productive as I was? And I had no answer for that, because it was just, that's what happens when you're doing things that you want to do. And unlike you, Sue, it's kind of interesting. I had no difficulty balancing teaching and writing. And in fact, one year when I was teaching and I, hoped that I was doing a good job, and I wound up finishing publication on 5 different books, and it just fit because, again, every morning I got up and said, I can't wait to get to my office to do this stuff. And then at the end of the day, I said, well, I can't wait to get home where I'm going to be with family. So for reasons that I don't know how, I managed to balance things in ways that worked for me.
That's great, Barney. And I really like what you said about, in response to Jeff's question, how did you stay so productive, but that it had to do with doing things that are fulfilling to you. So it seems like that's kind of the same answer about how you became successfully retired in terms of choosing things that are fulfilling. That's maybe the same secret to both of you in terms of your having had successful careers and making those choices as they came along in terms of what was fulfilling to you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And one other thing also that was fulfilling, and I think this is important, but it doesn't get enough play, is mentoring. Like Sue, you were talking about what you did. And over the years, I've mentored a fair number of people without actually thinking, oh, I'm mentoring someone. It was just, this is what you do. This is being a good citizen, a good friend, good colleague. And that's another thing that was very fulfilling too.
I just have one more question for the two of you as we get close to wrapping up this episode. And that is, do you have any other thoughts or any other advice that you think might be helpful for other people like me who are late career, approaching retirement, retired, in that sort of phase of their careers?
One thing that I think people might want to pay attention to, and this is the thing that I mentioned before about fearing that I would lose touch with students. Students will meet you where you are. And I made it clear to them that I wasn't trying to be cool. And they accepted me, for the way I was, and I accepted them for the way they were. And I remember, and this maybe is neither here nor there, but I'll say it anyway, is that in terms of my relationships with them, it went beyond simply teaching psychology. And it was broadening them in a liberal arts sense. And I remember on one student evaluation, one of my students wrote, I've learned, and this was on research team, she wrote, I've learned more about ancient Roman history in this class than I have in any other class I took. And, part of that was just to see if I could get students excited about some other stuff, because there's an interesting world out there around them. And so, I don't know, but I don't know what the formula would be for maintaining contact with students, but, working to accept them the way they are and they will accept you the way you are and not falling into the trap. And Charles Brewer talked about one professor who was teaching, I think, statistics, and said, I've been teaching this stuff for 30 years and the students still don't understand. You want to avoid that.
Yeah, definitely a lesson to be learned there. But it's interesting, at least for me, to think about what do students really take away from our courses in the long term. And I know there's been some research on that in terms of what content and what skills, but what I extracted from what you shared, Barney, is that at least for you, it sounds like a major goal was to get students excited in learning something, and particularly to have that memory that they had a professor who cared about them as a person, and as you said, you were willing to accept them the way that they were.
Yeah. And Charles Brewer said he remembered one thing from his undergraduate education, and that was that Lord Byron had one brown eye and one blue eye.
Well, that's important, I suppose. Sue, what about you?
I think probably for every psychology professor out there is to remember that once you retire from full-time teaching, you can still teach part-time. I'm sure that your department would be happy to have you teach part-time. I am sure that there are plenty of schools that are offering online or remote adjunct work, so that if you want to keep giving back, if you want to keep in touch with the students, that avenue exists. It's just you won't have the committee meetings, although it sounds like for Barney's colleagues, that's the part they really wanted. In which case, I know that some institutions would be happy to hire you on as a part-time administrative consultant of sorts, specifically to serve in those roles. But there are ways to transition out without just ripping off the Band-Aid and going skiing.
Yeah, also great advice. Thanks, Sue.
And then, Barney, I just have one more thing. I just got this book called Temples of Convenience and Chambers of Delight. It's published in '96. It is a history of the toilet.
Uh-huh. I haven't read it. I feel sadly deficient in my knowledge now.
Yeah, I know. How could you not have read this book yet? And I don't know how I could not have either. So I've got it on my stand, but I haven't opened it yet. I'm finishing another book first.
So you should email me the title so that I can fish it out.
I will do that. Thanks.
So as a bonus, we have a nice reading recommendation embedded in this episode.
Yeah, and one advantage of being retired is I can now read an endless supply of trashy spy novels.
Nice. Plus, you can learn about the history of the toilet, but you would have done that at any point in your career, I feel confident.
True, any point.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for your time and for a conversation that I really enjoyed. So thank you both for participating.
It's fun.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah,
and I hope you're closer to figuring out how you're going to make the decision.
You know, this conversation helped me. It truly did, and I hope it will help some other people too.
Oh, it's good to hear. Yeah, I hope it does help.
And to anybody who's listening, if you want to talk more about any of these concepts, including the history of toilets, please email me and/or Barney.
But if you wanted to know about the history of the pencil, don't contact Sue. She didn't like that, but I was fascinated from beginning to end.
Okay, so both of you should be on the lookout for your inboxes being flooded with inquiries about one or both of those topics. Thank you both. Appreciate it.